The earth trembled as the Viakari descended onto the planet. Towering figures of chitin and muscle, their kind had once been humanity's enemies. Now, under the fragile terms of the newly forged truce, they were allies, at least on paper. Among them was General Zyra Velshiran, a name that sent shivers down the spines of those who had fought in the war. She was a warrior bred for conquest, her exoskeletal armor gleaming like obsidian under the human sun. 7 feet tall, with 4 piercing violet eyes and razor-sharp mandibles, she exuded an aura of dominance. Zyra had slain countless humans on the battlefield, and now she was here, forced to work alongside them. Her mission: integration into the Earth Viakari military exchange program. To her, it was a joke. Humans were fragile things, soft flesh, inefficient biology, and an over-reliance on their crude technology. The very idea that they had held their own against the Viakari was something she had yet to fully comprehend. If not for their sheer unpredictability, the war would have ended long ago. Now, she found herself walking through the human military base, her clawed feet clicking against concrete, observing their so-called defenses with barely concealed disdain. Weak structures, inferior weaponry, sloppy formations. She had seen livestock pens more organized than this. A lone human approached her, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He was tall for his kind, though still shorter than her. Scars lined his hands, his uniform crisp but worn, a reflection of experience rather than vanity. His green eyes studied her with the scrutiny of a man who had seen too much war to be intimidated by an alien warrior. "You're late, General," he said flatly. His voice lacked fear. Zyra's mandibles clicked in irritation. "I was observing," she replied, crossing her arms. "Your defenses are full of weaknesses." The human, Commander Dorian Vale, as she recalled from the briefings, didn't flinch. If anything, he looked bored. "Then I guess it's a good thing you're here to teach us how to fight," he said dryly. "Wouldn't want you to waste your time." A flicker of amusement crossed her mind, quickly smothered. The human was bold. That was new. Most cowered or regarded her with open hostility. He did neither. "Are all humans this arrogant?" she asked. He shrugged. "Only the ones who have to prove themselves to giant alien generals who think we're weak." Zyra tilted her head. "You admit you have something to prove?" Dorian smirked. "I don't. But you do." She stiffened. "I am Viakari. I have no need to prove my strength." He gestured to the training field behind him, where human soldiers were engaged in combat drills. "Then why are you here?" Her mandibles twitched. She did not like being cornered in a conversation, and yet here was this human, this frail creature, daring to challenge her with nothing but words. "I am here to observe your methods," she said, keeping her voice even. "To understand how your kind fights." Dorian's smirk widened, and she had the distinct feeling she had walked into a trap. "Perfect," he said. "Then let's start with a fight." Zyra's eyes narrowed. "You challenge me?" "Not just me. All of us. We're going to train together. Unless, of course, you'd rather keep watching from the sidelines." A low growl rumbled in her throat. The audacity. "Very well, human," she said, stepping forward. "But do not cry when you realize the gap between our species is insurmountable." Dorian chuckled. "We'll see about that." And with that, the first battle between the human and the alien general had begun. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the moment that would change everything. Zyra had expected to dominate the training exercises. The first day alone should have been enough to prove humanity's inferiority, to solidify the fact that their fragile bodies and inefficient combat methods were nothing compared to the honed instincts of the Viakari. Yet as the days stretched on, a troubling realization set in. Humans did not break. She had seen creatures push themselves to exhaustion before, but never like this. The Viakari fought with precision and efficiency, their endurance built for explosive bursts of power. They relied on their natural armor, their genetic advantages, their overwhelming physical superiority. Humans, on the other hand, lacked these advantages, yet they compensated in ways that defied logic. They should have collapsed during the first endurance drill. When the sun beat down on them, when their muscles strained beyond their limits, when exhaustion should have consumed them, they kept going. Zaira had finished the long-distance march first, of course. She had felt no fatigue, no ache in her limbs, no strain in her breathing. The humans had lagged behind, their bodies drenched in sweat, their legs trembling. But they did not stop. Every time she thought one of them would collapse, they forced themselves forward. Dorian was the worst of them. The human commander was not the strongest among his kind, nor the fastest, yet he refused to show weakness. His face remained unreadable, his pace never wavering. When one of his soldiers stumbled, he pulled them up. When another hesitated, he urged them forward. His voice was steady, his resolve unwavering. Zaira didn't understand it. Why continue when the body screamed for rest? The Viekari would have acknowledged their limits and stopped. Humans, however, rejected their own weaknesses. They willed themselves to endure, even when it was illogical to do so. At first, she dismissed it as foolishness. But something about it unsettled her. Later that evening, as she observed the human soldiers tending to their wounds and laughing amongst themselves, she found herself standing beside Dorian. He smelled of sweat and dirt, his uniform damp from the day's exertion, yet his expression was relaxed. He exhaled, stretching his arms as he glanced at her. "You're staring," he noted. Zaira's mandibles clicked. "I do not stare. Could have fooled me." He smirked. "Something on your mind, General?" She hesitated. The question was simple, yet the answer eluded her. She folded her arms, her claws lightly scraping against the plating of her exoskeleton. "You do not stop," she finally said. Dorian raised an eyebrow. "And it is inefficient," he chuckled, shaking his head. "You think efficiency wins wars?" Zaira narrowed her eyes. "It has for my people." Dorian gestured to the field, where soldiers continued their cool-down exercises. "Then tell me, General, if efficiency was all that mattered, why didn't the Viekari win?" She stiffened. The words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. She could have countered with logic, with explanations of strategic miscalculations and human unpredictability. But standing here, watching these warriors push past their own limits, she could not ignore the truth. They had won because of something the Viekari had never accounted for. Stubbornness, tenacity, willpower. Zaira turned to Dorian, studying him in the dim glow of the base's floodlights. "Your people are reckless." "Maybe," he admitted. "But we survive." For the first time, she had no response. The following morning, the real challenge began. Zaira had trained in countless forms of combat. Her species excelled in warfare, their bodies designed for battle. She had assumed that a simple sparring match with a human would be beneath her, until she fought Dorian. He was smaller, weaker, lacking natural armor, yet he fought with an unpredictability that she hadn't anticipated. He did not attack in predictable patterns. His footwork was fluid, his movements constantly adapting. When she lunged at him, expecting a straightforward counter, he sidestepped at the last moment, redirecting her momentum against her. Zaira barely managed to catch herself before she stumbled. Her mandibles flared slightly. That was unexpected. "Not bad," Dorian remarked, rolling his shoulders. "But you're relying too much on brute force." Zaira straightened, her four glowing eyes narrowing. "It is effective," sometimes, he admitted. "But not always." They circled each other, the tension between them shifting. It was no longer about proving superiority. It was a battle of wits, a contest of adaptation. Zaira tried a new approach, using feints to lure him into making a mistake. But Dorian wasn't so easily fooled. He countered, maneuvering in ways that forced her to adjust. For the first time in years, Zaira felt challenged. Dorian moved faster than she expected, using techniques that were unorthodox yet effective. He didn't fight like a Viekari, bound by tradition and structure. He fought like a human, unpredictable, relentless, and impossible to fully control. Then, in a moment of daring, he did something that shocked her. He stepped into her range on purpose. Zaira had been preparing for a strike, her claws poised to strike at his side, but he used the momentum to twist behind her, hooking his arm around her throat in a maneuver that defied all logic. Before she could react, she was off balance, forced to the ground. Her back hit the mat. Silence filled the training hall. For the first time in her life, Zyra Velshiran had been defeated in close combat. Dorian hovered above her, his breathing heavy. He didn't pin her, didn't mock her. Instead, he grinned, offering his hand. "Not bad, General," he said. Zyra's pride screamed at her to reject the gesture. She did not need assistance. She did not need a human's help. And yet, she stared at his outstretched hand, at the confidence in his expression. There was no arrogance, no gloating, just respect. Something inside her shifted. Slowly, she reached up, clasping his hand. The moment their hands touched, she felt it. A spark of something unspoken. Dorian pulled her to her feet, stepping back with a nod. "You're learning," she exhaled, studying him. "You are more capable than I expected. See? We're not all weak," he teased. Zyra found herself clicking her mandibles in amusement. She did not laugh, her kind did not laugh, but the sensation was unfamiliar. This human was frustrating, irritating, reckless, and yet, she could not deny it any longer. He was not weak. In the days that followed, they continued to train together. It was no longer about proving dominance. Dorian pushed her, forced her to think in new ways. In return, she pushed him harder, testing his endurance, his resolve. Their sparring matches became a routine, a challenge neither of them wanted to back down from. Each day, Zyra learned something new about humans. They were illogical creatures, but they were not without merit. Each day, Dorian learned something new about Zyra. Beneath her hardened exterior was a warrior who had never truly been challenged before. The air between them changed. It was subtle at first, small glances, lingering moments after training, a new level of understanding. Zyra found herself watching Dorian in ways she never had before, noticing things she had once dismissed. The way his eyes gleamed with determination, the way his body moved with practiced ease, the way he refused to back down. She had never respected a human before, and she had certainly never felt drawn to one. But she could no longer ignore the truth. Dorian Vale was not like the others. And for the first time in her life, Zyra Velshiran was curious. The cool night air wrapped around the military base like a silent observer, carrying the scent of steel, sweat, and the faint aroma of burning fuel from the training grounds. Zyra stood atop the observation deck, her violet eyes scanning the landscape. The human structures were crude by Viakari standards, inefficient, primitive, yet they served their purpose well enough. She had spent weeks among these humans, training alongside them, studying them, adapting to their methods. Yet the more she learned, the more she found herself questioning the things she had once believed immutable. Humans were weak. That was the foundation of Viakari doctrine. They lacked natural armor, relied too heavily on tools, and were biologically inferior in almost every measurable way. And yet, here they stood. They had not been conquered. They had not been broken. They had won. Zyra clenched her claws. It was an uncomfortable realization, but one she could not ignore. Couldn't sleep. Dorian's voice broke through the silence, calm and knowing. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she let the moment stretch between them, listening to his approach. His steps were lighter than most, his movements precise yet unhurried. A warrior's gait, practiced but not forced. Eventually, she turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. "Viakari do not require sleep as frequently as humans," she said. Dorian leaned against the railing beside her, unfazed by the cool wind that tousled his dark hair. His green eyes reflected the distant floodlights of the base, sharp and thoughtful. "That doesn't mean you don't think too much," he countered. Zyra's mandibles twitched slightly. She had come to recognize his tone. Not mocking, not condescending, but teasing. It was something uniquely human, this ability to inject humor even in the face of tension. At first, it had irritated her. Now she found it intriguing. "I do not think too much," she said. Dorian chuckled. "Right? You're just standing up here in the middle of the night, staring at nothing, For no reason at all, Zyra exhaled, crossing her arms. I was reflecting. On what? She hesitated. She did not owe this human an explanation. And yet, she found herself wanting to speak. Your people, she admitted. Your resilience. It is unnatural. Dorian smirked. You say that like it's a bad thing. It is not, she said carefully. It is merely unexpected. My kind do not fight like yours. We do not push beyond our limits in the way that you do. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Yeah, I noticed. Zyra's eyes narrowed slightly. You expected us to be different? Dorian shrugged. Not exactly. I just assumed you were all. He hesitated, choosing his words. More rigid. More focused on the rules of combat than the actual fight itself. Zyra tilted her head. That is the most efficient way to wage war. Maybe, Dorian admitted. But war isn't always about efficiency. Zyra frowned. Then what is it about? Dorian's gaze flickered toward the horizon. Survival. Adaptation. Knowing when to follow the rules and when to break them. Zyra considered that. It was a strange perspective, one that went against everything she had been taught. Yet she could not deny that humans thrived on adaptability in ways the Viakari did not. You are difficult to predict, she admitted. Dorian smiled. That's kind of our thing. Silence stretched between them again, but this time it was not uncomfortable. For the first time since she had arrived, Zyra found herself relaxing in his presence. She did not understand this human, and yet she wanted to. The realization was unsettling. She had always regarded humans as lesser beings. Even now, the thought of being drawn to one felt absurd. And yet, her mind kept circling back to him, to the way he moved, the way he fought, the way he looked at her without fear. Dorian Vale was unlike any human she had ever encountered. Zyra, he said suddenly. She blinked. He had never used her name before. It had always been general, always formal, always distant. Hearing him speak it aloud, without rank, without pretense, sent a strange sensation through her. She turned to face him fully. What? Dorian hesitated for only a second before smirking. You're staring again. Her mandibles clicked in mild irritation. I do not. Yeah, I know. You don't stare, he teased. Zyra exhaled sharply. You are insufferable. And yet, here you are, standing with me instead of anyone else. She had no immediate response to that. Dorian's smirk faded slightly, replaced by something quieter, something unreadable. I meant what I said before, he said. You're learning. And not just about fighting. Zyra stiffened. There was something in his voice, something soft that she did not know how to process. She had fought countless battles. She had stood before enemies who wanted her dead. She had faced death itself without flinching. And yet, standing here, beneath the human stars, with his gaze locked onto hers, she felt vulnerable. It was an unfamiliar feeling, an unsettling one. Yet, for some reason, she did not move away. Dorian exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. I know you don't see humans the way we see each other. I get it. We're different. He paused, his gaze searching hers. But tell me something, General. Zyra's chest tightened at the way he said it. Do you still think we're weak? She had asked herself that same question for days now. And for the first time, she knew the answer. No, they were not weak. They were so much more. But she was not ready to say it aloud. Not yet. Instead, she held his gaze for a long moment before speaking. You fight well, she said at last. Dorian studied her, then smiled. Not a smirk, not teasing, just genuine. I'll take that as a compliment. Silence settled between them once more, but it was different this time. It was something new. And for the first time, Zyra wondered if this war had given her something she had never expected to find. The battlefield was nothing like the training grounds. There were no controlled environments, no observers waiting to step in if something went wrong. There was only chaos, fire, blood, and the deafening roar of war. Zyra moved through the wreckage like a shadow, her exoskeletal armor gleaming under the burning sky. The enemy had launched an unexpected assault on the human forward base, catching them off guard. Smoke choked the air, and the scent of metal and charred flesh clung to her senses. But she was not concerned about the battle itself. She was looking for him. Dorian had been in the thick of the fight when communications cut out. The last transmission had been garbled. His voice, sharp and commanding, before a sudden explosion drowned everything in static. Zyra's claws tightened around her weapon. Dorian Vale was not weak. She had told herself this over and over again, had witnessed his strength firsthand. But even humans, stubborn, reckless, impossible humans, could fall. She would not allow that. She moved with precision, cutting down enemies with calculated strikes, her instincts honed to a razor's edge. Humans fought beside her, their eyes filled with the same fire she had come to respect. They did not retreat, did not falter, and neither would she. A familiar figure emerged through the smoke. Dorian. Zyra exhaled sharply, relief hitting her like a physical force. He was battered, his uniform torn, blood streaked down the side of his face. But he was alive. "About time," he said, grinning despite the chaos. "Thought you'd never find me." Her mandibles twitched in something dangerously close to amusement. "You are reckless." "Yeah, well," Dorian winced, pressing a hand to his ribs. "Recklessness got me this far." Zyra approached him, her sharp gaze sweeping over his injuries. "You are injured." "Not the worst I've had," he said, but there was strain in his voice. Zyra reached for him without thinking. He tensed slightly as she touched his arm, but did not pull away. Something passed between them, something unspoken. "You should retreat," she said quietly. Dorian met her gaze. "You know I won't do that." She knew. Of course she did. "Then I will fight with you," she declared. Dorian chuckled, shaking his head. "You were gonna do that anyway." They stood together as the battle raged around them. Zyra had fought beside many warriors in her life, but never like this. Never with a human who refused to let her fight alone. She had spent her life believing humans were weak. She had been wrong. And now, standing beside one, she had never felt stronger. The battle ended in victory. The enemy had underestimated human resilience again, and Zyra had played a part in proving them wrong. But that wasn't what lingered in her mind as she stood outside the medical tent later that night, watching as Dorian sat on the examination table, letting a medic tend to his wounds. He caught her staring. "You know, for someone who claims not to stare," he teased. Zyra huffed. "I was ensuring your survival." Dorian smirked. "That's so?" She stepped inside, ignoring the medic's knowing glance. "You fought well," she admitted. Dorian grinned. "I'll take that as another compliment." Silence settled between them, thick with something unspoken. Zyra had spent weeks resisting the change she felt, the shift in how she saw him. But the battle had stripped away any illusions she had left. She cared about this human, and that terrified her. "You should rest," she said, her voice quieter than before. Dorian studied her. Then, in a move that surprised her, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers, warm and rough, curled around her own. Zyra stiffened, her instincts screaming at her to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she let him hold her hand. And for the first time in her life, Zyra Velshiran did not feel like a warrior. She felt like something more. Dorian's grip was steady, unyielding, yet gentle. "You're not bad at this whole caring thing, General," he murmured. She clicked her mandibles. "Do not push your luck, human." He laughed softly, and for once, she did not mind the sound. For once, she let herself enjoy it. And maybe, just maybe, she did not mind him.